Montana Territory, 1885. The sun hung like a copper coin in a cloudless sky, beating down on the parched earth. Dust devils twisted across the barren landscape, stirring up ghosts of a land that had once known rain. Heat shimmered off the distant mountains, blurring the line between earth and sky. Garrett Steele squinted against the relentless glare, his weathered hat pulled low over steel-gray eyes. His once blue cavalry shirt had faded to the color of the sky in winter, stained with the memories of 1,000 rides across this unforgiving territory. The Winchester rifle across his saddle gleamed with the care of a man who understood that out here your weapons were the difference between life and death. His Mustang mare had picked up the scent of water, nostrils flaring as she picked her way carefully down the rocky slope. Garrett was tracking a stray horse that had broken from his corral during the night storm. 6 hours of riding, and still the animal eluded him. He reached for his canteen, taking a measured sip of tepid water. A man learned to ration in this country, whether it was bullets, words, or water. The silence of the desert was absolute. No bird song, no wind through trees, just the soft crunch of hooves on stone and the occasional jingle of his spurs. That was why the sound cut through the air like a knife, distant but unmistakable. A human voice. A woman. "I cannot take it. Just do it, deeper." The cry hung in the scorching air, raw and filled with something that made the hairs on Garrett's neck stand rigid. It wasn't pleasure. It wasn't surrender. It was agony, the kind that comes when the soul is trying to break free from the body. He reined his horse to a sudden halt, head turning toward the sound. Years of tracking had taught him to distinguish between the ordinary and the dangerous. This was neither. This was desperate. Garrett slid the Springfield Model 1873 from its leather scabbard, the trap-door rifle as frontiersmen called it. He ran calloused fingers over the action, checking the loading gate and single-shot breech mechanism. This 45-70 government had dispatched its share of threats, its 405 grain lead bullet carrying enough stopping power to drop a charging bull buffalo at 300 yards. The brass cartridge system was a godsend compared to the paper cartridges and muzzle loading he'd endured during the war. He worked the lever, feeling the crisp resistance of well-maintained springs and the satisfying metallic click that echoed across the canyon. The walnut stock, worn smooth from years of handling, seated against his shoulder like an old friend, the 8.5-pound weight an extension of his own intent. The cry came again, weaker this time. Garrett spurred his horse forward, sending cascades of loose shale down the hillside as they descended toward a narrow canyon. The Mustang's hooves thundered against the earth, matching the sudden pounding of his heart. As they rounded the bend, Garrett pulled hard on the reins. 20 yards ahead, in the center of the canyon floor, stood a wooden post driven deep into the ground. Bound to it was a woman, her copper skin blistered by the sun, dark hair matted with blood and dust. Her buckskin dress was torn, exposing her back, where cruel welts crisscrossed like a grotesque map. Apache. Any other man might have hesitated, might have turned away. The wars between settlers and natives had left scars deeper than the canyons themselves. But Garrett Steele was not any other man. 20 years of regret had taught him that some choices define a life. Some moments can never be taken back. He dismounted in one fluid motion, rifle at the ready, as his eyes scanned the horizon for whoever had left this woman to die. Finding no immediate threat, he approached cautiously, boots crunching on the baked earth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse and thirst. "I mean you no harm." The woman lifted her head slowly, revealing a face both fierce and beautiful despite the cracked lips and sunburned skin. Her obsidian eyes met his without fear, without pleading. They held only a dignified resignation, the look of someone who had expected death but would not beg it to delay. As Garrett moved closer, he noticed something that made him pause. A small tattoo on the back of her neck, partially hidden by her hair. Not a tribal marking, but the unmistakable insignia of the United States Cavalry, the crossed sabers that he himself had once worn with pride. He holstered his sidearm and withdrew his hunting knife, moving behind the post. "Going to cut you free now," he said, beginning to saw through the thick ropes. "My ranch is half a day's ride from here. We can get you water, medicine." The woman said nothing as the ropes fell away. When the last binding was cut, she swayed dangerously. Garrett caught her before she could fall, surprised by the strength still evident in her frame despite her condition. Up close, he could see the fine scars around her eyes, the kind that came from squinting at pages of books, not from tracking game across the plains. She mumbled something in Apache, then switched to perfect, albeit accented English. "They will come looking for me." "Who?" Garrett asked, helping her toward his horse. But her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed against his chest, unconscious but still breathing. Garrett lifted her carefully, noting the expert way the welts had been placed to cause maximum pain, but minimal permanent damage. Someone had wanted her to suffer, not die. He placed her gently across his saddle, covering her with his spare blanket. The desert wind picked up, hot as a blacksmith's forge, carrying the scent of sage and suffering. In the distance, a vulture circled lazily, patient in its assessment of the living and the dead. Garrett didn't know her name or why she had been left to die in this forsaken place. But as he mounted behind her and turned his horse toward home, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This woman had secrets that someone had tried to beat out of her. Secrets worth killing for. What he didn't know was that from this moment, his fate had become irrevocably entwined with the daughter of the most powerful Apache chief in the territory, and that sometimes salvation comes with a price higher than either the savior or the saved are prepared to pay. The journey back to Steel Ranch was slow and careful. Garrett kept to the shadowed side of the ridges when possible, stopping twice to drip precious water between the woman's cracked lips. She remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Each time she stirred, fragments of Apache and English tumbled from her lips, disjointed words about photographs, silver, and a man called Blackwood. As the sun began its descent, painting the Montana landscape in hues of amber and blood, Garrett's thoughts drifted to another time, another place where the sky had burned just as bright. Sand Creek, Colorado territory. 21 years ago. He had been Captain Garrett Steele then, a decorated Union cavalry officer with principles that cost him his career. The memory of Sand Creek rose like bile in his throat. Not the full horror this time, just fragments. Chivington's cold voice ordering the massacre, the white flag of truce ignored, Garrett's own shouts drowned in gunfire. He'd tried to stop it, failed, resigned his commission the next day. What haunted him most wasn't the battle, but after the small Apache girl he'd found beneath her mother's body, the way she looked at him with trust as he carried her through the snow, promising safety he couldn't deliver. She'd died before reaching help, the daughter of a chief who'd believed white men's promises of peace. In the aftermath, Garrett had found her, a young girl no more than 6, clutching a rag doll, hiding beneath the body of her mother. He had wrapped her in his coat, carried her through the snow toward the medical tent. "You'll be safe now," he had promised. But promises were easy to make and impossible to keep in a land where promises had been broken since the first white man set foot on native soil. The girl had died in his arms before they reached the tent, her last breath a soft whisper against his chest. Later, he learned she was the daughter of Chief Whitehawk, who had been away hunting when the massacre occurred. The same chief who had negotiated the peace agreement Chivington had so brutally ignored. Garrett had resigned his commission the next day, turning his back on a military career that had once seemed destined for glory. He had wandered west, working cattle drives and breaking horses, trying to outrun the memories. Eventually, he had used his military land grant to stake a claim in Montana, building a small ranch on the edge of Apache territory. The ghosts of Sand Creek rode with him still. The woman stirred against him, bringing Garrett back to the present. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the land. Ahead, his ranch came into view, a modest affair of solid timber construction, a barn, corral, and a small garden plot that struggled against the Montana elements. Not much compared to the grand estates back east, but it was his, built by his hands, a refuge from a world that had shown him its worst. As they approached the main road leading to town, Garrett noticed a new poster tacked to a weathered pine. Slowing his horse, he read the bold print with growing concern. "Wanted, Apache woman escaped prisoner suspected thief, $100 reward." No name, no specific description, but the crude drawing bore enough resemblance to his unconscious passenger to tighten the knot in his stomach. Silver Creek was a small town, barely more than a trading post, saloon, and sheriff's office. News traveled fast, and questions would follow a man bringing in a wounded Apache woman. Garrett turned his horse away from the main road, cutting across his own property instead. The woman needed care, not a jail cell. Questions could wait. By the time they reached the ranch house, twilight had deepened into dusk. Garrett carried the woman inside, laying her gently on his own bed. He lit the oil lamp, filling a basin with water from the kitchen pump. With careful hands, he began cleaning the dust and blood from her face. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly now. She was perhaps 30, with high cheekbones and a proud brow. Despite her condition, there was a dignity in her features that spoke of intelligence and determination. This was no ordinary tribal woman. Someone had educated her, trained her to move between two worlds. He cleaned her wounds with whiskey and water, applied a salve of his own making, beeswax, bear fat, and herbs traded from a Shoshone medicine woman years before. Each welt told a story of calculated cruelty. These weren't the random strikes of drunken rage, but the systematic work of someone extracting information. As he wrapped clean cloth around the worst of the wounds, the woman's eyes fluttered open. In an instant, she went from unconscious to fully alert, rolling away from his touch and producing a small blade from within her torn sleeve. The knife was at his throat before he could blink, her eyes wide and fierce in the lamplight. "Where am I?" she demanded, the knife steady despite her weakened state. Garrett remained perfectly still, hands raised slightly to show he meant no threat. "My ranch, 15 miles east of Silver Creek." "You're safe here." "No one is safe," she replied, eyes darting to the windows, the door. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Garrett said simply. "Found you tied to that post, couldn't leave you there to die." The woman studied him, suspicion warring with necessity in her gaze. After a long moment, she lowered the blade, though she kept it tight in her grip. "My name is Kiona," she said finally, "daughter of Chief Maka of the Nedni Apache." Garrett nodded, keeping his distance as he moved to pour water into a tin cup. "Garrett Steele, this is my ranch." He offered her the cup, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. She drank deeply, the water bringing immediate color back to her face. "Why would a white rancher help an Apache?" she asked, her tone suggesting no answer would fully satisfy her. Instead of responding with words, Garrett reached into his vest pocket and withdrew an old pocket watch. The silver was tarnished, the glass face cracked, but the engraving on the back remained clear. He handed it to Kiona. She turned it over in her palm, reading aloud, "To my son Garrett. Protecting the vulnerable isn't charity, it's duty. J. Steele, 1854. "My father's," Garrett explained, taking the watch back carefully. "Gave it to me before I rode off to war. He was a simple man, believed in simple truths." Kiona's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My father has similar beliefs, though he might not apply them to men who look like you." A ghost of a smile crossed Garrett's weathered face. "Can't say I blame him, considering our history." Their eyes met across the small room, an understanding passing between them that required no words. They were from worlds that had been at war for generations, but in this moment, they were simply two people caught in circumstances beyond their control. The moment was broken by the sound of Garrett's dog barking outside, a low, cautious warning rather than the full-throated alarm of immediate danger. Someone or something was near the property. "Stay here," Garrett said, reaching for his Winchester. "Rest. We'll talk more when I return." Kiona nodded, settling back against the pillow, but keeping the small knife close. As Garrett moved toward the door, she spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "The man who did this, his name is Victor Blackwood. He carries a camera that captures souls and a knife that releases them." Garrett paused, the name striking a distant chord in his memory. "Photographer?" "And journalist," Kiona confirmed, "for the Rocky Mountain News. He is more dangerous than you can imagine." With that cryptic warning hanging in the air, Garrett stepped out into the Montana night, rifle ready, senses alert to whatever new threat might be approaching his door. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain that would never reach this parched corner of Montana. Garrett moved silently around the perimeter of his property, his footsteps practiced and deliberate. The Tumain, a wolfhound mix named Scout, padded alongside him, ears perked forward. Nothing seemed to miss. No horses nearby, no footprints in the dusty yard. Yet Scout had sensed something, and Garrett had learned to trust the animal's instincts more than his own. By the time he returned to the house, satisfied that no immediate threat lurked in the darkness, Kiona had managed to sit up on the edge of the bed. She had found a clean shirt of his draped over a chair and pulled it on over her torn dress. The garment hung loose on her frame, but preserved her dignity better than the shredded buckskin. "Nothing out there," Garrett reported, setting his rifle against the wall but within easy reach. "Might have been a coyote." Kiona nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. "They will come for me. If not tonight, then soon." "Who is they?" Garrett asked, pulling a chair across from her and sitting down. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his weight. "And why were you tied to that post?" Kiona's hand went unconsciously to her neck, fingers tracing the cavalry tattoo that had caught Garrett's attention earlier. "It is a long story, Mr. Steele." "Garrett," he corrected, "and we've got time." As Kiona shifted to find a more comfortable position, something fell from the leather pouch still secured at her waist. It landed on the wooden floor with a soft clink, a small shard of glass, curved and polished, no larger than a silver dollar. Garrett bent to retrieve it, holding it up to the lamplight. The glass caught the light strangely, magnifying and distorting the flame. It wasn't ordinary glass, but a piece of a lens, the kind found in expensive photography equipment. A memory stirred in Garrett's mind, something he'd seen years ago in a Denver newspaper office. "This from Blackwood's camera?" he asked, still examining the shard. Kiona nodded, taking it back carefully. "I broke it when he was taking pictures he shouldn't have." Garrett waited, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. Some stories couldn't be rushed, especially those born of trauma. "I was not always with my tribe," Kiona began, her voice stronger now. "When I was 12, the government agents came with papers. Education provisions, they called them. Part of the treaty my father had no choice but to sign. He chose me because I was strong." Her voice softened. "And because I was curious about the world beyond our mountains." She looked down at her hands, calloused but elegant. "The Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Captain Richard Pratt ran it. 'Kill the Indian, save the man' was his motto." She touched her shorn hair unconsciously. "First day they cut our braids, scrubbed our skin with lye soap until it bled, punished anyone who spoke their native tongue. I watched children younger than me beaten for whispering to each other in Navajo." She rose, moved to the window. 8 years. I learned Shakespeare and geometry, wore corsets and high-button shoes. Some nights I'd sneak to the attic, unwrap the small medicine pouch I'd hidden in my mattress, the last thing my grandmother gave me, and try to remember who I was." Her bitter laugh held no humor. "When they finally sent me home, my own cousins called me White Apple, red outside, white inside. The tribal elders watched me like I might steal their secrets for Washington." Meanwhile, at the Indian Agency office where I translated, the white officials kept their hands on their wallets when I walked in, spoke slowly as if I couldn't understand complex English. She turned back to Garrett. "I exist in the space between worlds, Mr. Steele. I know both, belong to neither." "But you had skills they needed," Garrett guessed, recognizing the familiar pattern. The government's strategy was consistent. Educate a few to control the many. "I became a translator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs," Kiona confirmed. "The government officials trusted me because I spoke like them. My people trusted me because I was Maka's daughter. I stood between worlds, belonging to neither." She turned the glass shard over in her palm. 3 weeks ago, Victor Blackwood arrived at the agency office. A famous photographer and journalist, they said, taking pictures of the noble savages for Eastern newspapers. Her mouth twisted around the words. "He wanted to document our vanishing way of life. The agency head ordered me to assist him." Garrett could see where this was heading, but that wasn't his real purpose. "No," Kiona said, eyes flashing with rekindled anger. "He was gathering information, taking photographs not for newspapers, but for blackmail. He focused on the women, especially the daughters of chiefs and elders. He said he would publish shameful images of us in every saloon from Montana to Missouri, unless—" "Unless what?" Garrett prompted when she fell silent. "Unless my father revealed the location of a silver deposit on our tribal lands," Kiona finished. "Land protected by treaty, but coveted by mining interests in Denver." She stood suddenly, moving to the window despite her injuries, peering out at the darkness as if expecting to see Blackwood's face staring back. When I discovered his true purpose, I confronted him. He had me arrested on false charges of theft, paid the local sheriff to look the other way while his men took me from the jail. And the post in the desert? Garrett asked, though he already knew the answer. They wanted information I didn't have, Kiona said simply. My father keeps the tribal secrets close. Even his daughter is not privy to the location of the sacred places. When I couldn't tell them what they wanted to know, they decided to make an example of me. Garrett's jaw tightened. He had seen such tactics before, during the war and after. Men with power using it against those who couldn't fight back, especially women. It was a story as old as conquest itself. This Blackwood, he said carefully. You said he works for the Rocky Mountain News. Kiona nodded. He has powerful friends, politicians, businessmen, former military officers, men who want the silver beneath Apache land. A memory clicked into place in Garrett's mind. A newspaper article from years ago, a photographer who had documented the aftermath of Sand Creek. Pictures that had made heroes of butchers, that had twisted the narrative of a massacre into a tale of military necessity. Victor Blackwood, Garrett said slowly. He was at Sand Creek after the massacre. His photographs helped cover up what really happened there. Kiona's eyes widened slightly. You know of this? Garrett looked away, the weight of 20 years of silence suddenly unbearable. I was there, Captain. 3rd Colorado Cavalry. I tried to stop it, but he trailed off, the inadequacy of words in the face of such horror too apparent. The room fell silent, save for the soft hiss of the oil lamp. Outside, a coyote called, the sound echoing across the empty plains like a spirit searching for its body. Kiona studied him with new eyes, reassessing everything about the man before her. You were at Sand Creek, she repeated. Neither question nor accusation, simply acknowledgement of a fact that changed everything between them. Before Garrett could respond, Scout began barking again, not the cautious warning from before, but the full-throated alarm of imminent threat. Both Garrett and Kiona tensed, turning toward the sound. Through the window, in the silver light of the rising moon, a figure moved across the yard toward the stable. Tall and gaunt, with something gleaming in his hand. The moonlight caught the object, reflecting off polished brass and glass. A camera. Blackwood, Kiona whispered, shrinking back from the window. Garrett reached for his rifle in one fluid motion, checking the chamber with practiced fingers. Stay inside, lock the door behind me. But Kiona was already moving, retrieving a revolver from a drawer beside the bed, Garrett's spare Colt. She checked it with surprising familiarity. Her movements those of someone who had handled firearms before. This is my fight too, she said, meeting his gaze with steely determination. Perhaps more than yours. Garrett wanted to argue, to insist she remain safely inside, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This woman had endured torture rather than betray her people. She had survived a journey that would have killed most men. She deserved the chance to face her tormentor. With a nod of acknowledgement, Garrett moved toward the door, Kiona following close behind. They stepped out into the Montana night, where the stars hung like silver coins in a velvet purse, witnessing another chapter in the long and bloody history of a land that had seen too much suffering. The hunt had become the hunted, and before dawn broke over the eastern mountains, more blood would soak into the thirsty Montana soil. Moonlight transformed the ranch into a landscape of silver and shadow. Garrett moved along the fence line, each step deliberate, Winchester held at the ready. Kiona kept pace 10 yards to his left, her movements silent despite her injuries. They communicated with hand signals, cavalry gestures that Kiona recognized from her time with the Bureau, another reminder of the strange bridges between their worlds. Scout had gone quiet, which concerned Garrett more than the barking. The dog was trained to maintain alarm until Garrett commanded otherwise. Silence meant either a false alarm or intervention. They reached the corner of the barn and Garrett signaled for Kiona to hold position. Peering around the weathered planks, he saw nothing at first. Then a shadow shifted near the corral, too tall for a coyote, too deliberate for the wind. The distinct click of a revolver hammer being cocked cut through the night. Garrett spun, bringing his rifle up, but too late. A man stood in the moonlight, tall and gaunt, half his face lost in shadow. In one hand, an old Remington revolver gleamed dully. In the other, a boxy camera on a tripod caught the moonlight, its brass fittings and glass lens reflecting like a demonic eye. "Don't move, Captain Steele," came a voice, half laugh, half madness. "It's the perfect scene. The disgraced hero, the savage princess, the moonlight. A tableau worthy of my collection." Victor Blackwood stepped fully into the moonlight, revealing a face that might once have been handsome before time and cruelty etched their signatures into the flesh. His eyes were bloodshot, gleaming with an unnatural intensity. A cold smile played across his thin lips. "Been tracking you for days, Miss Keona," he continued, camera lens sweeping between them. "Your father is beside himself with worry, offering quite a substantial reward for your safe return." "You're lying," Keona said, her voice steady despite the revolver pointed in her direction. "My father would never deal with a snake like you." Blackwood's smile widened. "Perhaps not willingly, but circumstances have a way of changing even the most stubborn minds, especially when daughters are at stake." Garrett kept his Winchester trained on Blackwood's chest, assessing the situation. The photographer stood 20 feet away, close enough for an accurate shot, but not so close that Garrett could rush him before he fired. The revolver in Blackwood's hand was pointed more toward Keona than himself. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Garrett demanded, seeking to focus attention away from Keona. "Want?" Blackwood seemed genuinely amused by the question. "I want what any artist wants, Captain. To capture the perfect moment. To create something that will outlive us all." He gestured with the camera. "I just need one final shot. The Apache princess, broken and humbled, and you, the white savior, dead beside her. That's art. That's truth." "The truth?" Garrett's voice hardened. "Like the truth you captured at Sand Creek? When you photographed murdered children and called it military necessity?" Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at being recognized. Sand Creek was a masterpiece of narrative. "I transformed butchery into heroism with the click of a shutter. History is written by the victors, Captain, but it's illustrated by men like me." The wind fell silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. In that moment of perfect stillness, Garrett fired. The Winchester roared, its muzzle flash briefly illuminating the yard in harsh orange light. The bullet grazed Blackwood's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. But Blackwood returned fire immediately, his revolver bucking in his hand. The bullet splintered the wood of the barn door beside Garrett's head. Keona fired the Colt, her shot going wide as Blackwood dove for cover behind the water trough. Glass shattered as a bullet struck the camera lens, sending fragments scattering across the dusty yard. "Inside!" Garrett shouted, laying down covering fire as Keona sprinted toward the house. He followed, backing toward the porch as Blackwood's bullets kicked up dirt at his feet. They crashed through the door, Garrett slamming it shut behind them and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. A bullet thudded into the wood seconds later, penetrating halfway through before stopping. "Windows!" Garrett ordered, moving quickly to shutter the openings. Keona was already ahead of him, closing and barring the iron frame shutters on the far wall. Outside, Blackwood had gone silent, more concerning than his shooting. "He won't leave," Keona said, checking the Colt's remaining bullets. 4. "Not while I'm alive to tell what I know." Garrett nodded, reloading the Winchester with practiced efficiency. "He's not working alone. No man tracks an Apache woman across tribal lands without help." They moved through the house, securing each potential entry point. Garrett's ranch house was built like a fortress, not uncommon in territories where raids had once been frequent. Thick timber walls, iron-hinged shutters, a root cellar that doubled as a hiding place in emergencies. "What exactly do you know that has Blackwood so desperate?" Garrett asked, positioning himself by the front window, creating a small gap in the shutters to observe the yard. Keona hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Trust was a rare commodity on the frontier, especially between Apache and white. "It's not just the silver mine," she finally said. "Blackwood and his associates have been systematically blackmailing tribal leaders across the territory. Photos, forged documents, threats against families. They're building a network of compliant chiefs who will sign away land rights." "For the railroads," Garrett guessed. Keona shook her head. "For something bigger. There's talk of statehood for Montana territory. Certain interests want to ensure the right people control the right resources when that happens. Blackwood has photographs of government officials meeting with mining executives, planning the seizure of treaty lands. If those became public, a sudden crash from the back of the house cut her off. The sound of breaking glass, followed by a heavy thud. "He's inside," Garrett whispered, moving toward the kitchen with Winchester raised. The house had gone silent again. Too silent. Garrett signaled for Kiona to check the bedroom while he moved toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight despite his careful steps. The kitchen was empty, the broken window allowing moonlight to spill across the simple wooden table and chairs. No sign of Blackwood. Garrett turned to rejoin Kiona. A blinding flash of light exploded in his face. The magnesium flash powder of a camera, ignited mere feet away. Garrett stumbled back, temporarily blinded, the Winchester knocked from his grasp by a powerful blow. He heard Kiona shout, followed by the report of the Colt. Another flash, another explosion of blinding light. Somewhere glass shattered, furniture toppled. Garrett's vision began to clear just as a weight slammed into him, driving him back against the stone hearth. Blackwood's face loomed inches from his own, teeth bared in a feral grin. Blood streamed from a wound on the photographer's shoulder, but his strength seemed undiminished. "I'm going to photograph your corpse, Captain," Blackwood hissed, pressing a knife toward Garrett's throat. A fitting end for the hero of Sand Creek, the man who tried to stop progress. Garrett locked his hands around Blackwood's wrist, straining to keep the blade from his flesh. The photographer was surprisingly strong, driven by a madness that gave him unnatural power. "You're on the wrong side of history, Steele," Blackwood continued, pressing harder. "The Indians are finished. Montana will be a state. The mines will be ours. Your Apache whore will hang, and no one will remember either of you." The knife edge touched Garrett's throat, a line of fire against his skin. He felt warm blood trickle down his neck. Then Blackwood's eyes widened in surprise. His grip on the knife faltered. He looked down to see Kiona's small blade buried to the hilt between his ribs, her hand still on the handle. "I will remember," Kiona said, twisting the knife. "My people will remember." Blackwood made a sound, half laugh, half gurgle, as blood bubbled from his mouth. He stumbled backward, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. His hand reached for the camera that had fallen to the floor, its lens shattered, the bellows torn. "You don't understand," he gasped, blood staining his shirt crimson. "The pictures, already sent, Denver, tomorrow's paper." Garrett retrieved his Winchester, keeping it trained on Blackwood as the man slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the whitewashed surface. The photographer's eyes were already glazing, but the maniacal smile remained fixed on his face. "Colonel Hammond sends his regards, Captain," Blackwood wheezed, his final words barely audible. "Says he's looking forward to finishing what we started at Sand Creek." With a final rattling breath, Victor Blackwood slumped forward, dead on the floor of Garrett Steele's kitchen. The shattered camera lay beside him, its broken lens reflecting the lamplight like a fractured star. Kiona stood motionless, the bloody knife still in her hand, her face an expressionless mask that concealed whatever storm raged within. "He mentioned Colonel Hammond," she said finally, her voice unnaturally calm. "You know this man?" Garrett nodded grimly, memories of Sand Creek surging forward once again. "My former commanding officer. The man who gave Chivington the intelligence that led to the massacre. I testified against him afterward. He was forced to resign, but never faced charges. And now he works with the mining interests," Kiona concluded. "The same men who won our silver." Garrett looked down at Blackwood's body, then at the broken camera. Something the photographer said nagged at him, a warning buried within the madness. "Blackwood said the pictures were already sent to Denver," he said slowly, "for tomorrow's paper." Kiona's composure cracked, fear flashing across her face. "If those photographs are published, my father will be ruined. The other chiefs will think he betrayed them. There will be war between the tribes, exactly what Hammond wants." Outside, the first gray light of dawn crept across the eastern sky. A new day was coming, but it promised only greater dangers. Blackwood was dead, but he was merely a pawn in a larger game, a game with stakes higher than either Garrett or Kiona had imagined. "We need to bury him," Garrett said practically, "then clean up. And then we ride for Denver," Kiona finished, "to stop those photographs from being published." Their eyes met across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever had brought them together, chance, fate, or the long shadow of Sand Creek, they were now bound by a common purpose: to prevent another tragedy, to stop the past from repeating itself in even bloodier fashion. Dawn broke over Montana territory, painting the land in hues of gold and promise. But for Garrett Steele and Keona, daughter of Chief Maka, the new day brought only the certainty of greater storms ahead, and the knowledge that sometimes, to find redemption, one must first pass through fire. Dawn stretched golden fingers across the Montana plains, burning away the night's shadows but not its memories. Garrett worked methodically, his shovel biting into the hard earth behind the barn. The grave didn't need to be deep, just sufficient to keep coyotes from digging up what remained of Victor Blackwood. The photographer's body lay wrapped in an old horse blanket, his shattered camera buried alongside him. A modern warrior entombed with his weapon. Keona emerged from the house, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. She had changed into clothes Garrett had provided, a simple cotton shirt tucked into trousers cinched tight with a leather belt, practical for riding. The garments hung loose on her frame but offered more protection than her torn dress. "The floor is clean," she said, handing him the cup. "No trace remains." Garrett nodded his thanks, pausing to drink. The coffee was strong and bitter, bracing him for what lay ahead. They had spoken little while cleaning Blackwood's blood from the floorboards, each lost in private thoughts about what had transpired and what was yet to come. "We should leave soon," Keona continued, looking toward the eastern horizon where dust plumes rose in the distance. "We are about to have visitors." Garrett followed her gaze. Even without a spyglass, he recognized the riding pattern. A disciplined approach, 5 riders spread in a shallow arc, not bandits or casual travelers, but men with purpose. "Apache," he confirmed, setting aside the coffee cup and resuming his digging with renewed urgency. Keona nodded. "My uncle, Running Wolf. He leads my father's warriors when the chief cannot ride." Her voice remained neutral, but tension showed in her shoulders. "He is less diplomatic than my father." "Will he attack?" "Not immediately," she replied. "He will want to confirm I am alive first. What happens after depends on what he believes about you." Garrett thrust the shovel into the earth one final time. The grave wasn't as deep as he'd have preferred, but it would have to do. Together they rolled Blackwood's body into the hollow, then filled it quickly, tamping down the soil and scattering brush over the fresh dirt. By the time they finished, the riders were a quarter-mile out. Garrett retrieved his Winchester from where it leaned against the barn, checking the action with practiced fingers. "How many bullets would it take to stop them?" Keona asked, watching him. "More than I have," Garrett answered honestly, "and that's assuming I wanted to stop them." Something like approval flickered in Keona's eyes. "Good answer." They walked to the front of the house and waited, standing side by side as the Apache riders approached. Garrett kept the Winchester pointed downward but ready, not threatening, but not surrendering either. The riders slowed to a walk as they entered the yard, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. They wore a mixture of traditional Apache garments and practical items adopted from white settlers: cotton shirts, leather vests, wide-brimmed hats. All carried rifles, and their faces were painted with red ochre stripes signifying a war party. The leader rode slightly ahead of the others. Running Wolf was older than Garrett had expected, perhaps 50, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His gray-streaked hair hung in twin braids, framing a face that seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains behind them. The warriors formed a semicircle, rifles resting casually across their saddles. The message was clear. They had not come to fight, but they were prepared to if necessary. Running Wolf raised his hand in greeting, then spoke in Apache. Keona responded in the same language, her tone respectful but firm. The exchange continued for several minutes, occasionally punctuated by gestures toward Garrett or the horizon. Garrett remained still, aware that his fate might depend on Keona's words. He caught occasional phrases he recognized from his years on the frontier, references to Blackwood, Denver, and photographs. Running Wolf's expression darkened as Keona spoke, his eyes frequently shifting to study Garrett with undisguised suspicion. Finally, Running Wolf addressed Garrett directly in accented but clear English. "My niece says you saved her from the picture man, that you fought him when he came to reclaim her." Garrett nodded once. That is correct. She also says you were at Sand Creek, a soldier. I was there, Garrett acknowledged, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. It's not something I'm proud of. Running Wolf studied him for a long moment, weighing truth against suspicion. Where is this Blackwood now? Garrett glanced toward the fresh grave beyond the barn. Running Wolf followed his gaze and nodded, apparently satisfied. Kiona says there are photographs in Denver that could bring war to our people. Running Wolf continued. She wishes to retrieve them. We're leaving for Denver today, Garrett confirmed. Running Wolf conferred briefly with the other warriors in Apache, their voices too low for Garrett to make out the words. When he turned back, his expression was stern, but less openly hostile. The path you walk is dangerous, Kiona, he said. Your father has called the Council of Warriors. When the moon is full, they will come. If Blackwood lives and the photographs exist, all will die, even the chief's daughter. Kiona straightened, her chin lifting slightly. Tell my father I will return with the photographs before the full moon. Tell him also that this man, she gestured to Garrett, has shed blood protecting our secrets. He is not our enemy. Running Wolf's expression suggested he remained unconvinced, but he nodded once. 3 days, Kiona. That is what I can promise. After that, even your father cannot hold back the warriors. With that, he wheeled his horse around. The warriors followed, disappearing back toward the eastern horizon as swiftly as they had come. When they were gone, Garrett turned to Kiona. 3 days to reach Denver, find the photographs, and return. That's impossible. Then we will have to do the impossible, she replied simply. Gather what we need. The train to Denver leaves Silver Creek at noon. As they prepared for the journey ahead, Garrett reflected on how quickly his solitary existence had been shattered. 3 days ago, his greatest concern had been a stray horse. Now he was embroiled in a conspiracy that threatened to ignite a war, partnered with the daughter of an Apache chief, and racing against a deadline that could cost both their lives. The Montana morning stretched bright and promising around them, but on the horizon, storm clouds were gathering. Literal and figurative, they cast shadows over the path ahead, a path that led straight into the heart of danger. They rode hard towards Silver Creek, taking the most direct route rather than the more cautious back trails. Time had become their most precious commodity, more valuable than safety or discretion. Garrett led on his bay gelding, with Kiona following on a spotted mare from his small herd, a spirited animal that seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. The town appeared in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings shimmering in the midday heat. Silver Creek had started as a simple trading post before expanding into a proper frontier settlement. It now boasted a general store, saloon, livery stable, and sheriff's office, along with a modest train station that connected it to the larger world beyond the territory. As they approached, Garrett slowed his horse, turning to Kiona, who had pulled alongside him. We need supplies and tickets, but showing our faces together could be dangerous, he said. Blackwood may have allies in town. Kiona nodded, understanding immediately. I will wait in the cottonwoods by the creek. You get what we need. Garrett reached into his saddlebag, retrieving a small leather pouch. From it, he removed a simple gold band, a wedding ring that had belonged to his mother. He handed it to Kiona. If anyone questions you on the train, you're Mrs. Steele, he explained. My wife. We're traveling to Denver to visit family. Kiona slipped the ring onto her finger, turning it thoughtfully. Your mother's? Garrett nodded, surprised by her insight. I will guard it with respect, she promised, understanding the significance of what he had entrusted to her. They separated at the town's edge, Kiona guiding her horse toward the stand of cottonwoods, while Garrett continued into Silver Creek. The main street was busy with the usual midday activity, wagons delivering goods, townspeople moving between businesses, cowboys fresh from the range seeking refreshment at the saloon. Garrett tied his horse outside the general store and entered, nodding to familiar faces while maintaining the casual demeanor of a rancher on a routine supply run. The proprietor, Henry Williams, greeted him warmly. Steele, haven't seen you in town for near a month. Beginning to think the coyotes got you. Been busy with the south pasture, Garrett replied easily, selecting ammunition, coffee, and hardtack from the shelves. Need these and 2 tickets on the afternoon train to Denver. Williams raised an eyebrow as he tallied the items. Denver? What business takes you to the big city? Family matter, Garrett said shortly, discouraging further questions. Williams seemed about to press the issue when the store door opened, admitting three men whose appearance immediately commanded attention. Two were clearly hired guns, weather-beaten faces, well-worn holsters, eyes that constantly assessed threats. The third man, standing between them like royalty among servants, wore an expensive tailored suit despite the frontier setting. Garrett recognized him immediately and felt his muscles tense. Colonel James Hammond, formerly of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, now a wealthy businessman with mining interests throughout the territory. Hammond had aged since Garrett had last seen him, his once black hair now silver at the temples, his frame slightly stooped, but the cold authority in his eyes remained unchanged. Hammond surveyed the store with casual disdain before his gaze settled on Garrett. For a moment there was no recognition, just the dismissive assessment of a wealthy man evaluating someone beneath his station. Then awareness dawned, and Hammond's thin lips curved into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Captain Steele," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an Eastern education. "What an unexpected pleasure. It's been, 20 years?" "Colonel," Garrett acknowledged with a curt nod, continuing to gather supplies. He paid for his purchases, including the train tickets, acutely aware of Hammond's calculating stare. "Heading somewhere?" Hammond inquired, noting the tickets Williams handed over. "Just some business in Denver," Garrett replied, gathering his packages. "Denver? What a coincidence. I'm returning there myself on tomorrow's train." Hammond stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know, Steele, I've often thought about our last conversation after Sand Creek. Your testimony before the Congressional Committee was quite passionate." "I told the truth," Garrett said simply. Hammond's smile tightened. "Your version of it, perhaps. Tell me, how does a decorated officer end up a lonely rancher in this godforsaken territory? Was it principle, or merely an inability to function in civilized society?" Before Garrett could respond, the store door opened again. A tall man in a dusty marshal's uniform entered, his weathered face breaking into a grin at the sight of Garrett. "Steele, damn, it's good to see you," Marshal Samuel Jenkins exclaimed, extending a hand. Garrett shook it, genuinely pleased to see a friendly face. Jenkins had served with him during the war, a fellow officer who had witnessed the same horrors and made similar choices afterward. "Sam, didn't know you were back in Silver Creek." Jenkins nodded. "Circuit duty, been riding between here and Fort Benton." His eyes shifted to Hammond, and the warmth in his expression cooled noticeably. "Colonel Hammond, wasn't aware you were in the territory." "Just passing through, Marshal," Hammond replied smoothly, "checking on some investment properties before returning to Denver." An uncomfortable silence fell over the store. Williams busied himself reorganizing merchandise while the hired guns flanking Hammond shifted their stances subtly, hands drifting closer to their holsters. Jenkins broke the tension, turning back to Garrett. "Heard you might be headed to Denver on today's train. Mind if I join you for the ride? Got business with the federal marshal there." Garrett understood immediately. Jenkins was offering protection, having sensed the hostility between him and Hammond. "Be glad for the company," he agreed. Hammond's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained fixed. "Well, this has been a delightful reunion, but I have matters to attend to. Perhaps we'll continue our conversation in Denver, Captain Steele." He tipped his hat and departed, his men following like well-trained dogs. When they had gone, Jenkins turned to Garrett, his expression serious. "You've stepped in something deep, haven't you?" "Deeper than you know," Garrett admitted. "Hammond's involved with something big. Land grabs, mining claims on Apache territory, blackmail. A photographer named Blackwood was working for him." "Blackwood," Jenkins repeated, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Nasty piece of work. Been hearing rumors about him threatening some of the tribal leaders with compromising photographs. You know where he is now?" Garrett hesitated, then decided truth was necessary. "Dead. He came after me at my ranch last night. It didn't end well for him." Jenkins absorbed this without visible reaction. "Self-defense, I take it?" "He didn't leave much choice." The marshal nodded once. "Then as far as I'm concerned, justice was served, but Hammond won't see it that way. Blackwood was valuable to him." "I know," Garrett said grimly. "That's why I'm headed to Denver." Blackwood sent photographs to the Rocky Mountain News, images that could start a war between the Apache bands and give Hammond the excuse he needs to seize their land. Jenkins whistled softly. "You're playing a dangerous game, old friend." Not playing, just trying to stop a massacre worse than Sand Creek. Understanding passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared history and shared guilt. Jenkins had been there too, had seen what happened when greed and hatred were given free rein. "The train leaves in an hour," Jenkins said finally. "I'll meet you at the station. Watch your back until then. Hammond's men are still in town." Garrett gathered his supplies and left the store, senses alert for any sign of Hammond's gunmen. The town suddenly felt hostile, filled with potential threats. He moved efficiently between businesses, collecting the remaining items they would need for the journey, constantly scanning for danger. As he tied his packages to his saddle, movement at the edge of town caught his eye. 3 riders were heading toward the cottonwoods where Keona waited. Something in their purposeful approach raised alarms in Garrett's mind. They weren't Hammond's men, but local cowboys he recognized from the Double R Ranch, men known for their hatred of Indians and their quick tempers. Garrett mounted quickly, turning his horse toward the creek. He had barely cleared the town when the sound of a gunshot echoed across the open ground. Urging his mount to a gallop, he rode hard toward the cottonwoods, Winchester in hand, praying he wasn't too late. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their pale leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. Garrett approached cautiously, rifle ready, scanning for signs of Keona and the riders he'd seen heading this way. The creek gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, seeming oblivious to human conflicts. Movement flashed between the trees, a rider breaking cover, spurring his horse across the shallow water. Behind him came another gunshot, and the rider jerked in the saddle but kept going. Garrett recognized one of the Double R cowboys, clutching his arm where blood stained his shirt sleeve. Dismounting quickly, Garrett tied his horse and advanced into the trees. The sharp crack of a revolver sounded again, followed by angry shouts. He moved toward the commotion, staying low and using the cottonwoods for cover. The scene emerged through the dappled shadows. 2 cowboys had Keona cornered against the creek bank. She held Garrett's spare Colt steady in a 2-handed grip, her back to a large tree. One cowboy lay sprawled on the ground, clutching his thigh where blood soaked his denims. The other crouched behind a fallen log, revolver aimed at Keona. "Drop it, you Apache witch," the cowboy shouted. "Think we don't know you're the one they're looking for? There's $100 for bringing you in." Keona's expression remained impassive, the revolver unwavering. "The next one goes between your eyes. Leave now." The cowboy laughed harshly. "Big talk from a squaw. Frank's bringing more boys from town." "You're outnumbered." Garrett stepped into view, Winchester aimed at the cowboy's chest. "She's not alone." The cowboy's head whipped around, eyes widening at the sight of Garrett. "Steele, what the hell? You protecting this savage?" "This woman is under my protection," Garrett confirmed, his voice level but carrying unmistakable threat. "And she's right about your next option. Leave now, take your friend, and we'll call it even." Indecision warred on the cowboy's face. He looked from Garrett to his wounded companion, then back to Keona. Finally, survival instinct won out over bounty hunting. He lowered his gun slowly. "This ain't over, Steele," he muttered, moving to help his friend to his feet. "The boss will hear about this. Tell your boss that if he or any of his men come near my ranch or this woman again, they'll need coffins, not bandages," Garrett replied coldly. The cowboys retreated, supporting their wounded comrade between them. When they had gone, Garrett turned to Keona, who was already reloading the Colt with cartridges from a small pouch. "You hit?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head. "They were clumsy, loud. I heard them coming before they crossed the creek." There was a hint of professional disdain in her tone. "We need to move," Garrett urged. Their friend went for reinforcements. The train leaves in less than an hour. They gathered their horses and rode quickly, staying away from the main road into town. Garrett led them on a circuitous route that approached the train station from behind, where a line of freight cars would provide cover until boarding. The Silver Creek station was little more than a wooden platform with a small ticket office and telegraph. The train, a mixed passenger and freight service, was already at the platform, its locomotive hissing steam as it took on water for the journey ahead. Marshal Jenkins waited near the passenger car, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He nodded when he spotted Garrett and Keona approaching. "Heard there was trouble at the creek," he said quietly when they reached him. "You two all right?" "Nothing we couldn't handle. Garrett replied, helping Keona dismount. Hammond's men? Jenkins shook his head. Still at the hotel far as I know. But there's talk in town. Someone recognized your companion from a wanted poster. Keona tensed, her hand drifting toward the hidden Colt. Easy, Jenkins said, noting the movement. I'm not in the business of collecting bounties on innocent people, especially when the charges are trumped up by men like Hammond. A whistle blew, signaling imminent departure. Jenkins helped them board quickly, leading them to a private compartment he'd secured. Once inside with the door closed, he turned to Keona with renewed interest. You must be Maka's daughter, he said. I've dealt with your father several times. A fair man, considering what my people have done to yours. Keona studied him carefully before responding. You know my father? Jenkins nodded. I was the federal marshal assigned to negotiate the last treaty amendment. Your father was the only chief willing to sit down and talk after what happened at Yellow Creek. Recognition dawned in Keona's eyes. You are the marshal with the silver star, the one who returned our sacred objects when the soldiers took them. Tried to anyway, Jenkins acknowledged. Some things should remain with their rightful owners. The train lurched forward, wheels grinding against steel rails as it began its journey south toward Denver. Through the window, Garrett saw a commotion at the far end of the platform. The Double R cowboys had arrived with reinforcements, scanning the departing train with angry expressions. Seems we left just in time, he observed. Jenkins followed his gaze. Those boys will have to answer to me when I return. Attacking a woman, regardless of her heritage, doesn't stand in my jurisdiction. As the train gathered speed, leaving Silver Creek behind, Garrett felt a momentary sense of relief. They had cleared the first hurdle, but Denver and Hammond lay ahead. The photographs Blackwood had sent were still a threat, and the deadline set by Running Wolf loomed over them like a storm cloud. Tell me about these photographs, Jenkins said, settling into the seat across from them. What exactly are we looking for in Denver? Keona and Garrett exchanged glances, silently debating how much to reveal. Finally, Keona spoke. Blackwood was more than a photographer. He was gathering evidence for Hammond, documentation of meetings between government officials and mining executives, planning the seizure of treaty lands, but he was also creating leverage against those who might oppose them. Blackmail material, Jenkins concluded. Keona nodded. He targeted women, especially daughters of chiefs and tribal elders. The threat was clear. Cooperate or see your family shamed in every saloon from here to Missouri. And you were one of his targets, Jenkins stated rather than asked. I discovered what he was doing, Keona continued, her voice steady despite the painful subject. He had me arrested on false charges, then taken from the jail by his men. They wanted information about a silver deposit on our tribal lands. Jenkins's expression darkened with anger. These photographs he sent to Denver, they're of you? And others, Keona confirmed. But more importantly, they include evidence of the conspiracy. Names, dates, locations. Enough to expose Hammond's entire operation if they fell into the right hands. Or enough to start a war if they're published the wrong way, Garrett added. The Rocky Mountain News is owned by investors with ties to the mining interests. They'll frame the story however Hammond wants. Jenkins considered this, his weathered face grave. The newspaper office will be guarded. Hammond has friends in Denver law enforcement, men who look the other way when the price is right. We'll find a way in, Garrett said with determination. You'll need help, Jenkins insisted. I have contacts in Denver, honest men who won't stand for what Hammond is planning. The train rounded a bend, revealing the vast Montana landscape stretching away to distant mountains. The afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light, creating a deceptive serenity that belied the dangers they faced. Keona touched the gold band on her finger, turning it thoughtfully. 3 days, she said softly. That's all the time my father can give us. After that, the warriors will come. Then we'd better not fail, Garrett replied simply. The three fell silent, each lost in private thoughts as the train carried them steadily toward Denver in a confrontation that would determine the fate of nations, both white and Apache. The wheels clicked rhythmically on the rails, counting down the precious hours that remained before Running Wolf's deadline expired. Night descended as the train journeyed southward, moonlight silvering the passing landscape. The rhythmic clacking of wheels against rails created a hypnotic backdrop to the tense silence in the compartment. Kiona had fallen into a light sleep, her head resting against the window while Jenkins dozed across from her. Garrett remained awake, thoughts churning like the locomotive's driving wheels. He stared into the darkness beyond the glass, seeing not the moonlit terrain, but the ghosts of Sand Creek that had haunted him for 20 years. He remembered the cold November air, the orders that had seemed wrong even before they were carried out. Colonel Chivington's voice echoed in his memory. Kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice. Garrett had tried to stop it, had ordered his men to stand down, had confronted Chivington directly. But in the chaos and bloodlust that followed, his commands were ignored. By nightfall, nearly 200 Apache lay dead, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Hammond had been there too, a major then, standing at Chivington's right hand. While Chivington took the public blame in the congressional inquiry that followed, Hammond had escaped largely unscathed. Garrett's testimony had forced him to resign his commission, but powerful friends had ensured he landed softly, in the mining industry, where his military connections proved valuable. Now Hammond was poised to finish what had begun at Sand Creek, the complete dispossession of the Apache from their ancestral lands. Only this time he would use photographs and newspapers instead of bullets and bayonets. The method was different, but the outcome would be the same. A soft voice interrupted his dark reverie. "You should rest," Kiona said, her eyes open and watching him with quiet intensity. "Tomorrow will require strength." Garrett shifted in his seat, surprised she had awakened so silently. "Can't sleep. Too many ghosts." Kiona nodded understanding. "Sand Creek?" "Among others." She studied him for a moment, then spoke with unexpected gentleness. "My people believe that ghosts cling to those who fear them, face them in the light, and they lose their power." "Some ghosts can't be faced," Garrett replied, "not when you're responsible for creating them." "You tried to stop the killing," Kiona observed. "Running Wolf told me this. The older warriors remember a cavalry officer who stood between them and Chivington's men." Garrett looked at her with surprise. "They remember that?" "Apache memory is long," Kiona said simply, "for both enemies and allies." Jenkins stirred across from them, opening one eye. "She's right, you know. I've heard the same stories from other tribes. The officer who defied orders. Some call you Ghost Soldier." Garrett shook his head, uncomfortable with the notion that his failed attempt at intervention had become legend. "I didn't do enough. Couldn't save them." "Yet here you are," Kiona said softly, trying again. The observation hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Garrett had no response. He turned back to the window, but the ghost seemed less substantial now, as if Kiona's words had diminished their power. The train continued through the night, carrying them closer to Denver in the confrontation that awaited. Eventually, exhaustion overcame even Garrett's restless conscience, and he drifted into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of Sand Creek, but this time the outcome was different. This time his orders were obeyed. This time the Apache escaped the slaughter. This time a young girl lived instead of dying in his arms. He awoke at dawn to find Kiona watching him, her dark eyes somehow knowing. She said nothing, but offered him water from a canteen. The simple gesture contained an understanding that transcended words. The landscape outside the window had changed dramatically overnight. The vast plains had given way to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Denver lay ahead, nestled at the foot of the towering peaks that had once been the ancestral hunting grounds of Kiona's people. Jenkins was already alert, checking his revolver and badge with the methodical care of a lawman preparing for potential trouble. "We'll be there in an hour," he informed them. "I have a contact meeting us at the station. Thomas Burke, a reporter for the Denver Tribune. He's been investigating Hammond for months." "Can he be trusted?" Garrett asked. Jenkins nodded. "Burke lost his brother at Sand Creek. He's no friend to Hammond or anyone associated with that massacre." "The Tribune," Kiona noted, "not the Rocky Mountain News." "The Tribune is smaller but respected," Jenkins explained. "They've been publishing pieces questioning the treatment of Indian tribes and the ethics of certain mining operations. Hammond hates them, which makes them our natural allies," Garrett concluded. The train began its approach to Denver, slowing as it passed through the growing outskirts of the city. Denver in 1885 was a bustling frontier metropolis, a far cry from the small mining camp it had been during the gold rush days. Brick buildings and wooden storefronts lined streets busy with wagons, carriages, and pedestrians. The clash between frontier ruggedness and eastern sophistication was evident everywhere, from the mix of cowboys and businessmen on the sidewalks to the contrast between saloons and opera houses. As the train pulled into Denver Union Station, Jenkins outlined their immediate plan. Burke will meet us at the side exit. He's arranged rooms at a boarding house where Hammond's people won't look for us. We'll regroup there, then make our move on the newspaper office tonight. The station platform was crowded with travelers, freight handlers, and the usual assortment of hawkers selling everything from newspapers to patent medicines. Jenkins led them through the throng toward a less-used side exit, his marshal's badge ensuring they passed without question. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a notebook tucked under his arm waited in the shadow of a freight office. He straightened when he spotted Jenkins, offering a quick handshake. "Sam, good to see you," he said, before turning curious eyes toward Garrett and Kiona. "These are your friends from Montana?" Jenkins made the introductions quickly. Thomas Burke of the Denver Tribune, Captain Garrett Steele, formerly of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, and Kiona, daughter of Chief Maka of the Nedney Apache. Burke's eyebrows rose at Kiona's identity, but he recovered quickly, offering a respectful nod. "An honor, Miss Kiona. I've written about your father's efforts to maintain peace despite considerable provocation." Kiona acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "We should move," Burke continued, glancing around nervously. "Hammond arrived on yesterday's train. He's been at the Rocky Mountain News office all morning." This news heightened their sense of urgency. They followed Burke to a waiting carriage, climbing in quickly while he gave instructions to the driver. As they pulled away from the station, Burke lowered his voice despite the privacy of the enclosed vehicle. "The photographs you mentioned in your telegram, Sam, they're scheduled for tomorrow's edition. The editor is calling it an expose on the savage customs of the Apache tribes, with a focus on ritual humiliation of women." Kiona's face remained impassive, but Garrett noticed her hands tighten into fists at this description. "There's more," Burke continued grimly. "Hammond met with Governor Evans this morning. Sources say they discussed the Apache problem and the possibility of military intervention if there's any uprising." He's creating a pretext, Garrett realized aloud. The photographs will provoke the Apache warriors, giving Hammond the excuse he needs for a military response. And when the dust settles, the silver mines will conveniently end up in friendly hands, Jenkins finished. "It's Sand Creek all over again," Burke agreed, but this time with the veneer of legal authority. The carriage turned onto a quiet side street lined with modest boarding houses. Burke directed them to one near the end of the block, a 3-story wooden structure with a small sign identifying it as Mrs. Miller's lodging house. "The owner is sympathetic to our cause," Burke explained as they disembarked. "Her husband was a Quaker missionary to the tribes before his death. She keeps rooms for Indians who come to the city on legitimate business, but can't find other accommodations." Inside, they were greeted by a stern-faced woman in her 60s, whose expression softened visibly when Burke introduced Kiona. Mrs. Miller led them to rooms on the top floor, away from other guests and with a view of the street below. "No one will disturb you here," she assured them. "Meals are served in your rooms, not the common dining area." Thomas explained the delicacy of your situation. When they were alone, Burke spread a rough map of the city on the table, marking key locations with a pencil. "The Rocky Mountain News office is here, on Larimer Street, 2 stories with the printing press in the basement. The photographs and plates would be in the editor's office on the 2nd floor." He indicated another building nearby. "Hammond is staying at the Brown Palace Hotel, the new one that opened last year. Very exclusive, very well guarded." "What about the editor?" Garrett asked. "Could he be reasoned with?" Burke shook his head. "William Stapleton is fully in Hammond's pocket. His newspaper holdings are financed by the same Eastern investors backing Hammond's mining ventures." "Then we need to get those photographs tonight," Jenkins decided, "before they can go to press." "The newspaper office will be guarded," Burke warned. "Hammond doesn't take chances." Garrett studied the map thoughtfully. "What about the building next door? Any access from the roof or adjoining walls?" Burke considered this. "The building to the north is a bookstore with an apartment above. The owner closes at 6. If you could get access to his shop after hours, I can handle that, Jenkins said confidently. They spent the next hour refining their plan, with Burke providing details about guard rotations and the newspaper's nightly routine. As evening approached, they prepared for what would likely be their only chance to prevent a war that could destroy what remained of Apache independence. Garrett cleaned and loaded his revolver methodically, checking each chamber with practiced care. Across the room, Kiona was doing the same with the Colt he had given her. Their eyes met briefly over the weapons. Two people from opposite worlds, united by a common purpose and the shadows of a shared past. Outside, the sun began its descent behind the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across Denver. Night would soon provide the cover they needed for their desperate mission. But even as darkness fell over the city, Garrett knew the true shadows were those of history, the long, dark legacy of broken treaties, massacres, and the relentless march of what some called progress. Tonight, they would attempt to prevent history from repeating itself. Tomorrow would determine whether they had succeeded or merely delayed the inevitable. Darkness settled over Denver like a velvet cloak, bringing with it the peculiar quiet that falls upon cities when businesses close and respectable citizens retire to their homes. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light at regular intervals along Larimer Street, illuminating the imposing facade of the Rocky Mountain News Building. Garrett observed the newspaper office from the shadows of an alleyway across the street. The structure rose 2 stories, its brick exterior punctuated by tall windows, now mostly dark except for a soft glow from the editor's office on the second floor. 2 men stood guard at the main entrance, their posture suggesting hired guns rather than regular employees. "Stapleton's still working," Burke whispered, nodding toward the illuminated window. "He often stays late before major stories break." Garrett turned to Jenkins. "Any luck with the bookshop?" The marshal nodded. "Owner's an old friend of the Tribune. Left us a key to the rear entrance." He gestured toward the adjacent building. "There's access to the roof, and the buildings share a common wall. Second-floor windows are less than 6 feet apart." Their plan was simple but dangerous. Jenkins and Garrett would enter through the bookstore, cross to the newspaper office via the upper windows, and retrieve the photographs and printing plates. Burke would create a distraction at the front entrance if necessary, while Kiona kept watch from a vantage point overlooking both the street and their escape route. Kiona adjusted the dark shawl covering her distinctive features. In the dim light, with her hair pulled back and European clothes, she might pass for a Mexican or Italian woman. Still subject to prejudice in Denver, but less likely to draw immediate alarm than an Apache. "If something goes wrong," Garrett told her, "don't wait. Make for the train station. Burke knows people who can get you back to your father." Kiona fixed him with a level gaze. "Nothing will go wrong," she stated with quiet certainty. "But if it does, we leave together or not at all." Before Garrett could argue, Jenkins signaled it was time to move. They separated, each heading to their assigned positions. Garrett followed the marshal through narrow back streets to the bookstore's rear entrance. The lock yielded easily to Jenkins's key, allowing them silent access to the darkened shop. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of paper, leather, and binding glue. Shelves of books loomed like sentinels in the darkness as they navigated carefully toward the stairs. Each footstep was placed with deliberate care, avoiding the telltale creaks that might betray their presence. The bookstore's second floor served as both storage and the owner's modest apartment. A narrow hallway led to a window overlooking a small gap between buildings. Through it, Garrett could see the darkened windows of the Rocky Mountain News' second floor, one of which stood partially open to admit the cool night air. "That's our way in," Jenkins whispered, sliding the bookstore window open. Garrett assessed the gap between buildings. A fall would mean broken bones at best, likely alerting the guards below. He removed his boots, securing them to his belt to ensure silent movement once inside. Jenkins did the same, then produced a length of rope from his pack. "I'll go first," the marshal said, tying the rope around his waist. "You anchor me. Once I'm across, I'll secure this end for you." Garrett braced himself as Jenkins climbed onto the windowsill. With practiced agility belying his years, the marshal leapt across the narrow gap, landing with only the faintest thud on the newspaper building's ledge. He balanced there momentarily before slipping through the open window, disappearing into the darkness beyond. After a tense minute, the rope pulled taut, signaling Jenkins had secured it. Garrett followed the same path, the rope providing assurance against a fatal fall. As he eased through the window into the newspaper office, the contrast with the bookstore was immediate. Where the bookshop had smelled of leather and paper, the newspaper office carried the sharper odors of ink, metal, and tobacco. Jenkins was already moving through the darkened room, navigating around desks and filing cabinets with practiced stealth. They were in the reporter's bullpen, a large open area filled with desks where journalists wrote the stories that would become tomorrow's news. At the far end, light spilled from beneath a door marked editor. They approached cautiously, listening for any sound from within. Muffled voices reached them. Stapleton was not alone. Garrett pressed his ear against the door, straining to distinguish words. Guaranteed placement on the front page, came a voice he recognized immediately. Colonel Hammond. The Apache won't be able to ignore this kind of provocation. The photographs are quite shocking, responded another voice, presumably Stapleton. Are you certain about the timing? Once published, there's no taking it back. That's precisely the point, William, Hammond replied smoothly. Governor Evans needs a pretext for military action. The Apache reaction to these photographs will provide it. Garrett exchanged a glance with Jenkins. Their suspicions were confirmed. Hammond was deliberately orchestrating a conflict that would give the government justification for seizing Apache lands. Jenkins pointed to the lock, then produced a set of thin metal tools from his pocket. While Garrett kept watch, the marshal worked on the door, his experienced fingers manipulating the pins inside the lock mechanism. After several tense moments, there was a soft click. Wait for them to leave, Jenkins whispered. No sense confronting Hammond directly if we can avoid it. They retreated into the shadows as the editor's door opened. Hammond emerged first, immaculately dressed despite the late hour. He was followed by Stapleton, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and an anxious expression. The first editions go out at 5, Stapleton was saying. I've arranged for special deliveries to the military post near the reservations. By noon tomorrow, every settler and soldier in the territory will have seen them. Excellent, Hammond approved. I'll be at the governor's mansion for breakfast. When news of the Apache reaction begins arriving, we'll already have the military orders drafted. The two men moved toward the stairs, their voices fading as they descended to the street level. Garrett counted to 30 after hearing the front door close before approaching the editor's office again. Jenkins had the door open in seconds. The editor's office was more opulent than the Spartan reporter's area. A large oak desk dominated the room, flanked by leather chairs and bookshelves filled with bound newspaper volumes. Gas lamps cast a warm glow over framed front pages commemorating historic events. A separate table held a photographer's developing equipment and a series of photographic plates. And there, spread across the desk, were the photographs. Garrett felt a surge of rage as he saw them. The images showed Apache women, clearly prisoners, in various states of undress and distress. Blackwood had arranged his subjects to suggest depravity and savagery, when in reality he was documenting his own. Among them were several photographs of Kiona, tied to the same post where Garrett had found her. Her expression in the images was one of defiance despite her condition, a stark contrast to the narrative the newspaper intended to present. Interspersed with these exploitative images were others more damning to Hammond, photographs of meetings between government officials and mining executives, documents laid out on tables with maps of Apache territories, handshakes between men whose cooperation should have been impossible unless corruption was involved. Blackwood was thorough, Jenkins observed grimly, examining the photographs. He documented everything, both for the story Hammond wanted to tell and as insurance against Hammond himself. Garrett gathered the photographs quickly. We need to find the printing plates. Without them, they can't reproduce these. Jenkins moved to the development table, locating several metal plates etched with the reverse images that would appear in tomorrow's paper. These he collected as well, wrapping them in cloth to prevent damage. That should do it, he said, securing the bundle. Let's go before... The sound of the downstairs door opening stopped him mid-sentence. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, multiple men moving quickly. Someone must have spotted us, Garrett concluded, drawing his revolver. The window? Jenkins shook his head. Too risky with them this close. We need another way out. Garrett scanned the office desperately, noticing a narrow door partially hidden behind a bookcase. There. They moved quickly, discovering a private staircase leading both up to the roof and down to a rear exit. The footsteps were nearly at the editor's office as they slipped onto the stairwell, easing the door closed behind them. Up, Garrett decided. We'll cross the rooftops back to the bookstore. They ascended silently, emerging onto the flat tar paper roof of the newspaper building. The night air felt cool after the stuffiness of the stairwell. Across the expanse of adjoining rooftops, Garrett could see Kiona's silhouette on a water tower, keeping watch as planned. When she spotted them, she made a quick hand signal. Danger below. Hammond's men had the building surrounded. Jenkins gestured toward the bookstore roof. We can make it across, then down through the shop. They moved carefully across the newspaper building's roof, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky. As they neared the edge, shouts erupted from below. They had been spotted. A bullet ricocheted off the brick near Garrett's head. He dropped flat, pulling Jenkins down beside him. More shots followed, peppering the roof edge with deadly accuracy. They've got us pinned, Jenkins grunted. Can't cross by them firing like that. Garrett assessed their options. The gap between buildings was too wide to jump from their current position. Going back meant capture. Staying put meant eventual defeat when Hammond's men accessed the roof. Movement caught his eye. Kiona was on the move. She had descended from her watching position and was making her way along a lower roof line toward the rear of the newspaper building. As Garrett watched, she swung down from the edge, disappearing from view. What's she doing? Jenkins muttered. The answer came moments later when gunfire erupted from a new direction. The alley behind the newspaper office. Kiona had created a diversion, drawing fire away from their position. Now's our chance, Garrett said. They scrambled to the edge and leapt across to the bookstore roof, landing hard but safely on the other side. Below, chaos had erupted. Burke had apparently joined Kiona's diversion, as shouting and gunfire echoed from multiple directions. Hammond's men were confused, unable to determine the true threat among so many distractions. Garrett and Jenkins wasted no time, descending through the bookstore to the rear exit. They emerged into the alley just as Kiona appeared around the corner, moving swiftly despite the danger. This way, she urged, leading them through a maze of back streets away from the newspaper office. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded. Denver's layout, a grid interrupted by diagonal avenues, created numerous escape routes for those who knew the city. Burke had chosen their meeting point well, a small chapel in the immigrant district where few questions would be asked of strangers seeking sanctuary. They slipped through the chapel's side door into a small antechamber. Burke was already there, a fresh cut above his eye but otherwise unharmed. Did you get them? He asked immediately. Jenkins unwrapped the bundle, displaying the photographs and printing plates. Every last one. Burke examined them quickly, his expression darkening at the exploitative images before shifting to grim satisfaction at those documenting Hammond's conspiracy. These prove everything, he said. The land grab, the corruption, the manufactured conflict. With these, we can stop Hammond before it begins. But where? Kiona asked practically. The Rocky Mountain News won't publish them, and Hammond will have every lawman in Denver looking for us by morning. Burke smiled thinly. The Tribune's press is smaller, but it still works. We can have a special edition on the streets by dawn, the real story, with evidence of Hammond's conspiracy. Hammond will try to stop it, Garrett warned. Let him try, Jenkins replied, patting his badge. I'm still a federal marshal. Any interference with my investigation would constitute obstruction of justice. They moved quickly through back streets to the Tribune's modest offices. Unlike the Rocky Mountain News building, the Tribune operated from a converted warehouse with few windows and multiple exits, a necessity for a paper that often published stories powerful men wanted suppressed. Inside, Burke roused the night editor and two trusted typesetters. While Jenkins stood guard, they worked feverishly to prepare the explosive exposé. Kiona helped select which photographs to publish, excluding the exploitative images of Apache women, but including damning evidence of Hammond's conspiracy. Garrett dictated his account of events in Montana, carefully explaining the context behind Blackwood's actions. By 3 in the morning, the presses were rolling. The Tribune's special edition would hit the streets before the Rocky Mountain News could distribute its inflammatory story. Hammond's carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling. As dawn approached, Burke handed them the first copies of the paper. The headline was bold and unequivocal. conspiracy exposed, mining interests, plot war against Apache, exclusive photographs reveal corruption at highest levels. This will reach the governor's mansion before Hammond's breakfast meeting, Burke said with satisfaction. And copies are already on their way to Washington by telegraph. Hammond's political protection will evaporate once this reaches the right people. Garrett studied the paper with mixed emotions. They had succeeded in exposing the truth, but Hammond remained dangerous. Men like him rarely surrendered power without a fight. "We need to get Keona back to her people," he said. "The deadline still stands, regardless of what happens here." Jenkins nodded agreement. "The morning train leaves in 2 hours. I've arranged passage for all of us." As they prepared to depart, Burke approached with a serious expression. "Hammond won't give up easily. He still has men throughout the territory. Your journey home won't be safe." "Few journeys worth taking are," Garrett replied simply. They left the Tribune office as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern plains. Denver was awakening, unaware that the day's news would shake the foundations of power throughout the territory. For better or worse, the truth was now in the open. As they made their way toward the train station, Garrett reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought him to this moment. 20 years after Sand Creek, he was still fighting the same battle, but this time perhaps with a chance to change the outcome. The train rattled northward, its iron wheels eating up the miles between Denver and Montana territory. Garrett watched the landscape transform outside the window, the lush valleys of northern Colorado giving way to the starker beauty of Wyoming, then the rolling grasslands of southern Montana. After the tension of Denver, the journey felt almost peaceful despite the urgency of their mission. In the private compartment Jenkins had secured, Keona studied the Tribune's special edition for perhaps the 20th time. The paper had already created a sensation in Denver. Burke had sent a telegram to their first stop, reporting that Hammond had been summoned to the governor's office immediately upon publication. The conspiracy was unraveling exactly as they'd hoped. "Will it be enough?" she asked, voicing the concern that had lingered unspoken between them. "Words on paper cannot stop bullets." "They can if they reach the right people," Jenkins assured her. "The Telegraph has already carried the story to Washington. The Indian Bureau is sending investigators. Hammond's political protection is crumbling." Garrett was less optimistic. He had seen too many promises broken, too many investigations buried. "Running Wolf gave us 3 days. We'll make it back just in time. But whether the warriors will accept newspaper stories as victory remains to be seen." The train stopped briefly in Cheyenne, where Jenkins received another telegram from Burke. He read it with growing satisfaction. "Hammond has been detained for questioning," he announced. "Federal marshals seized documents from his Denver office. The governor has publicly denounced any unauthorized actions against Apache lands." This was encouraging news, but Garrett remained cautious. Hammond had powerful allies and considerable resources. Being detained for questioning was far from being held accountable. As they continued northward, Keona spoke of her father. "Maka is a man of peace, but not of weakness. He will hold the warriors back if he can, but many young men are eager to prove themselves in battle. They have heard stories of Sand Creek their entire lives, stories that end with never again." "I can't blame them," Garrett admitted. "If I were in their position, I might feel the same." Night fell as they crossed into Montana territory. The train would reach Silver Creek by morning, leaving them half a day's ride to Garrett's ranch. They would arrive just before Running Wolf's deadline expired, assuming no further complications. Keona eventually drifted into sleep, her head coming to rest against Garrett's shoulder. He remained awake, watching the moonlit landscape pass by, mind filled with possibilities and contingencies. So much could still go wrong. Hammond's reach was long, and they were returning to isolated country where law was often what a man made it. Jenkins caught his eye from across the compartment. "She's remarkable," the marshal observed quietly. "Most people would have broken under what she endured." Garrett nodded agreement. "Her strength goes deeper than most." "And what about you?" Jenkins asked with the directness of old friendship. "After this is over, what then?" It was a question Garrett hadn't allowed himself to consider. From the moment he'd found Keona in the desert, events had carried them forward with such urgency that the future beyond their immediate mission seemed irrelevant. "One day at a time," he replied finally. "First we prevent a war. Then we'll see." Jenkins studied him thoughtfully. "You know, the Tribune's expose will change things. Hammond's mining plans are finished. The Apache territories should be secure for now. For now, Garrett echoed, knowing how quickly such security could vanish. Treaties had been broken before. They would be broken again. Dawn was breaking as the train pulled into Silver Creek Station. The small town appeared unchanged from when they'd left it, yet Garrett felt as though years had passed rather than days. They disembarked cautiously, alert for any sign of Hammond's men or other threats. The livery stable provided fresh horses, the owner eyeing Keona with curiosity, but asking no questions when Jenkins displayed his marshal's badge. Within an hour, they were riding east toward Garrett's ranch, pushing the horses as fast as they dared on the rough trail. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, Garrett reined in sharply. In the valley below, at least 20 mounted warriors surrounded his property. Their faces were painted for war, lances and rifles held at the ready. Running Wolf had kept his word. The deadline had arrived. "We need to approach carefully," Jenkins advised. "No sudden movements." Keona moved her horse forward, raising her hand in a gesture of greeting and identification. After a moment, one of the warriors, Running Wolf himself, detached from the group and rode up the slope toward them. His face was stern, painted with the red ochre stripes of war. He acknowledged Keona with a slight nod before turning his attention to Garrett and Jenkins. "The moon is full," he stated simply. "My niece promised to return with proof of Blackwood's defeat before this time." Keona handed him the Tribune newspaper. "Blackwood is dead. His master Hammond is in custody. Their plans are exposed to the world." Running Wolf examined the paper skeptically, his expression suggesting printed words held little weight against broken promises of the past. "Maka awaits at the ranch," he said finally. "He will decide if this is enough." They followed him down the slope toward the assembled warriors. As they approached, the Apache parted to reveal a distinguished figure waiting on the porch of Garrett's ranch house, Chief Maka himself. Keona dismounted swiftly, approaching her father with a mixture of respect and determination. Garrett and Jenkins followed more slowly, understanding the delicacy of the moment. This was Apache business first. Their role would come later. Maka was perhaps 60, with a dignified bearing that required no war paint or ceremonial dress to command attention. His face bore the deep lines of a leader who had guided his people through decades of broken treaties and encroaching settlement. He wore simple buckskins and a single eagle feather in his gray-streaked hair, a man secure enough in his authority to need no elaborate displays. He embraced his daughter briefly before turning his attention to Garrett. His dark eyes revealed nothing as he studied the rancher who had saved his daughter and potentially his tribe. "My daughter speaks highly of you, Garrett Steele," he said in perfect, unaccented English. "She says you saved her when others would have passed by." Garrett inclined his head respectfully. "She saved herself. I merely provided the opportunity." A flicker of approval crossed Maka's features. "Humility is rare among the white man's virtues." He gestured to the newspaper Keona had given Running Wolf. "She also says you have prevented a war." "We've exposed the truth," Garrett clarified. "Whether that prevents war depends on how many people choose to accept it." Maka considered this. "Truth is like water. It finds its own level no matter what obstacles men place before it." He turned to address his warriors in Apache, then back to Garrett. "You were at Sand Creek." It wasn't a question, but Garrett answered anyway. "Yes, I tried to stop it. I failed. Yet here you stand, 20 years later, still trying to prevent bloodshed between our peoples." Maka's gaze was penetrating, searching for deception and finding none. "Wait." The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that went beyond simple morality or duty. Garrett found himself speaking from a place deeper than conscious thought. "Because some debts can never be repaid, but must still be acknowledged. Because I've seen what happens when good men remain silent. Because your daughter showed me that courage isn't about winning battles, but about facing truth no matter how painful." Maka listened intently, weighing each word. Finally he nodded, as if arriving at a decision he had perhaps already made. "The Council of Elders meets tonight," he announced. "You will attend, both of you." He included Jenkins with a glance. "We will decide the path forward, war or peace." With that, he turned and walked into Garrett's house, followed by Running Wolf and several other warriors. The remaining Apache made camp around the property, their presence a reminder of how quickly the situation could still deteriorate. "Well," Jenkins said quietly, "that went better than expected." Garrett wasn't so sure. Maka had neither accepted their evidence nor rejected it. The decision would come tonight at the council meeting, a meeting where they would be present but unlikely to have much influence. Kiona approached them, her expression somber. My father is a wise man, but he answers to the council. Many elders remember Sand Creek as if it happened yesterday. Their voices carry weight. What can we do? Garrett asked. Speak truth, she replied simply. It may be all we have. As the day progressed, more Apache arrived. Elders, medicine men, representatives from allied bands. By sunset, nearly 100 had gathered around Garrett's ranch, transforming the once quiet homestead into a diplomatic ground where the future of white Apache relations would be decided. Fires were lit as darkness fell. Garrett watched from his porch as elaborate preparations were made for the council meeting. A large circle was cleared, with special positions marked for the chief, the elders, and, he noted with surprise, for himself and Jenkins. Kiona had disappeared into a makeshift lodge with her father and several elder women. When she emerged, she had changed from the practical travel clothes into traditional Apache dress, her hair adorned with beads and feathers befitting her status as the chief's daughter. She approached Garrett as the council fires were being lit. It is time, she said softly. Remember, speak only truth, even when it hurts. My people value honesty above eloquence. Garrett nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Together with Jenkins, they walked toward the council circle where Maka and the tribal elders awaited. The council circle glowed with firelight, throwing elongated shadows across Garrett's ranch yard. 20 elders sat in positions of honor, their weathered faces solemn in the flickering light. Warriors formed an outer circle, silent witnesses to the proceedings. Behind them stood the women and younger members of the tribe completing the assembly. Maka occupied the position facing east, where the sun would rise to bring new beginnings. To his right sat the medicine man, White Crow, his face painted with symbols whose meanings were known only to the initiated. To Maka's left was Running Wolf, representing the warriors. Garrett and Jenkins were directed to seats directly across from Maka, a position both of honor and scrutiny. Kiona sat slightly behind her father, her role that of witness rather than participant in this male-dominated council. For nearly an hour, the elders spoke in Apache, their voices rising and falling with the cadence of formal oratory. Though Garrett couldn't understand the words, the emotions behind them were clear. Anger, fear, pride, determination. Several times, elders pointed to him or to the Tribune newspaper that lay in the center of the circle, their tones questioning or accusatory. Finally, Maka raised his hand for silence. He looked directly at Garrett and spoke in English, ensuring his words would be understood by all present. We have discussed the events that brought us here. We have considered the evidence you have brought and weighed it against our experiences with the white man's promises. Now we would hear from you directly. He gestured to Jenkins first. Marshal, you represent the white man's law. Tell us why we should believe this law will protect us when it has failed so many times before. Jenkins rose, his weathered face grave in the firelight. He spoke without defensiveness, acknowledging the justice of the question. I cannot undo the failures of the past, he began. The law has not served your people well. Treaties have been broken, promises forgotten. But I can tell you this, the tide is turning. What happened at Sand Creek and afterward brought shame to many in Washington. There are those who seek to make amends, to establish justice that applies to all peoples. He held up the newspaper. This story has reached Washington. The photographs and documents we recovered prove that Hammond and his associates acted outside the law. They will face consequences. An elder interrupted, speaking in Apache. Maka translated. He asks what consequences? Will Hammond hang for plotting against our people? Will the miners who covet our land be removed? Jenkins answered honestly. Hammond will likely face prison, not hanging. The mining interest will be checked for now, but I cannot promise they will never return. What I can promise is that this exposure has created powerful allies for your people. The Tribune will continue to publish the truth. Federal marshals will investigate the corruption. The governor himself has denounced any unauthorized actions against Apache lands. His words were met with skeptical murmurs. Another elder spoke at length, his gestures passionate. When he finished, Maka turned to Garrett. Elder Blackhorse says words on paper mean nothing. He asked what you personally will do when new men come with new plans to take our land. Will you stand with us again, or will you forget once the danger passes? All eyes turned to Garrett. The question cut to the heart of the matter. Beyond newspapers and investigations lay the simple truth that Apache survival depended on the character of their neighbors, both as individuals and as a society. Garrett rose slowly, feeling the weight of history and expectation. He had never been one for speeches, preferring action to words. But in this moment, words were the action required. 20 years ago, I failed to stop a massacre, he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of long-buried guilt. I gave orders that were ignored. I testified before Congress, but justice was never served. I left the army, believing I could escape the responsibility by walking away. He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the elders one by one. I was wrong. Walking away solves nothing. Change comes only from those who stay and fight for what's right, day after day, year after year. Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew his father's pocket watch, holding it where all could see. My father gave me this before I went to war. He told me protecting the vulnerable isn't charity, it's duty. I failed in that duty once. I won't fail again. He turned to Maka. I cannot speak for all white men. I cannot promise that greed and prejudice will vanish. But I can promise this. My ranch stands on the border between our peoples. As long as I live, it will remain a place where Apache travelers find safety and respect. If threats come again, I will stand with you. Not with words on paper, but with my rifle and my life if necessary. The sincerity in his voice carried across language barriers. Even those who understood no English seemed to grasp his meaning through tone and posture. When he finished, silence fell over the assembly, broken only by the crackling of the council fire. Maka conferred quietly with the medicine man and several elders. Finally, he rose and addressed the gathering in Apache, speaking at length. The elders nodded slowly, some reluctantly, others with greater conviction. When he finished, he switched to English. The council has decided we will give peace another chance, not because of newspapers or promises from Denver, but because of the actions of individuals. Marshall Jenkins has shown that some who wear the white man's star still honor justice, and you, Garrett Steele, have demonstrated that redemption is possible through action, not words. He moved to the center of the circle and removed a small leather pouch from his belt. From it, he withdrew a length of red cloth, its color deep as blood in the firelight. In our tradition, this color represents both war and brotherhood, Maka explained. When worn in battle, it signifies the willingness to shed blood. When exchanged in peace, it creates a bond stronger than treaties. He held the cloth toward Garrett. If you wear this, you belong to our tribe. If you cast it aside, then leave this land forever. The moment hung suspended in time. Every eye watched as Garrett stepped forward and accepted the cloth. Without hesitation, he wrapped it around his wrist and tied it securely. I choose to stay, he said simply. A murmur ran through the assembly, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. Maka nodded once, then turned to address his people in Apache. Whatever he said seemed to settle the matter, for the formal atmosphere of the council began to dissolve. As the elders rose, signaling the end of the meeting, Kiona approached Garrett. Her eyes held a warmth that transcended cultural differences and the tensions of recent days. Do you know what this means? She asked quietly, touching the red cloth on his wrist. Garrett shook his head. In our tribe, when two people wear the same color of blood, it signifies they are bound together. In our language, married. Surprise registered briefly on Garrett's face before understanding dawned. Maka's gesture had been more significant than a simple acceptance of an ally. It was an acknowledgement of what had grown between Garrett and Kiona during their shared journey. Does this mean, he began. It means my father sees what is in our hearts, Kiona replied simply. Whether we choose to honor that bond is for us to decide. Before Garrett could respond, Running Wolf approached, his expression less hostile than before but still wary. The warriors will remain camped here tonight, he informed them. Tomorrow we return to our territory. Kiona, your father wishes to speak with you before he retires. As Kiona departed to find Maka, Jenkins joined Garrett, watching the Apache begin to settle for the evening around the ranch. Well, you've had quite a day, the marshal observed dryly. Prevented a war, joined a tribe, and apparently got married. Garrett gave him a sharp look. You understood what Maka was doing with this? He raised his wrist with the red cloth. Jenkins chuckled. I've worked with the tribes long enough to recognize a binding ceremony when I see one, though I suspect he left you an honorable way out if you choose not to accept the implications. Garrett gazed across the firelit yard to where Kiona stood with her father, her profile elegant against the night sky. In the span of a few days, she had transformed his understanding of courage, of justice, and of possibility. What had begun as a simple act of human decency, saving a woman left to die, had evolved into something far more complex and profound. What will you do now? Jenkins asked, sensing his friend's contemplation. One day at a time, Garrett replied, echoing his words from the train. But this time the future seemed less uncertain, the path forward illuminated by something more substantial than mere hope. The night deepened around them, stars emerging in the vast Montana sky. Apache songs rose from the encampment, ancient melodies that had echoed across these plains long before white settlers arrived and would continue long after current conflicts were forgotten. In that moment, Garrett understood that redemption wasn't a destination to be reached, but a journey to be lived, day by day, choice by choice. Sand Creek would always be part of his past, but it no longer defined his future. Dawn broke clear and crisp over the Montana plains. The Apache camp stirred with activity as preparations began for the journey back to their territory. Women packed belongings while warriors checked horses and weapons. The night had passed peacefully, a small miracle given the tensions that had brought them together. Garrett moved through the activity, offering water and supplies for the journey ahead. Many of the Apaches still regarded him with suspicion, but there was a difference now, a tentative acceptance born of Maka's blessing and the red cloth he wore. Jenkins approached, saddlebags slung over his shoulder. I'll be heading back to Silver Creek, he said. Need to telegraph Denver about yesterday's council. Hammond's lawyers will be working overtime to free him. You think they'll succeed? Garrett asked. Jenkins shrugged. Men like Hammond rarely face the full consequences of their actions, but his reputation is destroyed, his political protection compromised. The mining scheme is finished, at least in its current form. That's something, at least. It's more than something, Jenkins corrected. You've changed things, Garrett. Maybe not forever, but for now. That's all any man can hope to accomplish. They clasped hands in farewell, the grip of old comrades who had faced danger together. Will you be all right here? Jenkins asked, glancing around at the Apache encampment. Garrett nodded. I think so. Maka's word carries weight, and Kiona. He hesitated, still processing the implications of the ceremony. Jenkins smiled knowingly. She's remarkable. Don't overthink it. With that, the marshal mounted his horse and departed, leaving Garrett to navigate the new reality that had formed around his once solitary existence. Throughout the morning, Garrett observed Kiona moving among her people, her status as the chief's daughter evident in the respect she commanded. She had resumed her role as cultural bridge, translating when necessary, mediating minor disputes, ensuring smooth interactions between the Apache and their reluctant host. By midday, most of the tribe had departed, returning to their own lands with news of the council's decision. Only Maka, Running Wolf, and a small group of personal guards remained, along with Kiona. They gathered on Garrett's porch for a final discussion before departure. The peace is fragile, Maka acknowledged, but it is peace. The photographs have been destroyed, Hammond's plans exposed. For now, the immediate danger has passed. What about the silver mines? Garrett asked. Hammond isn't the only one who knows they exist. True, Maka agreed, but knowledge is not access. Our warriors will patrol the boundaries more vigilantly now, and with federal attention on the territory, others will hesitate before attempting what Hammond failed to accomplish. Running Wolf spoke up, his tone pragmatic. We should establish regular communication. If new threats emerge, we must know quickly. The suggestion surprised Garrett, coming from the warrior who had been most suspicious of him. I'm willing. How would you suggest we proceed? Signals from the ridge, Running Wolf explained. Smoke by day, fire by night. Different patterns for different messages. Kiona can teach you our codes. The implication hung unspoken. Kiona would remain at the ranch, at least for now. Garrett glanced at her, finding her eyes already on him, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Maka observed the exchange with the wisdom of one who had navigated many such moments in his long leadership. My daughter makes her own choices, he said simply. She was educated in your world as well as ours. She understands what lies on either path. As they concluded their discussion, dark clouds began gathering on the western horizon. The first storm of the season was approaching after months of drought. The Apache viewed this as a significant omen, water bringing new life to parched earth, washing away the past. Maka prepared to depart, embracing his daughter with dignity but evident affection. When he turned to Garrett, he offered not a handshake, but the traditional Apache greeting between equals, a clasp of the forearm. You wear the red cloth of our people, he said. Remember its meaning. Blood spilled in war brings only more bloodshed. Blood shared in kinship brings strength to all. With those words, he mounted his horse and departed with Running Wolf and the remaining warriors. Garrett and Kiona stood side by side, watching until the riders disappeared beyond the eastern ridge. They were alone for the first time since Denver, the future stretching before them, undefined and full of possibility. The approaching storm mirrored the emotional currents between them, powerful, unpredictable, potentially transformative. Your father didn't ask you to return with him, Garrett observed. He knows I must choose my own path, Kiona replied, as must you. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The air grew heavy with the scent of rain and sage. What do you want, Kiona? Garrett asked directly, turning to face her. Not what duty demands or what others expect. What do you want? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I want to belong somewhere, not caught between worlds as I have been since childhood. I want purpose beyond mere survival. She hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. I want to build something that bridges what was and what could be. Her eyes met his, unflinching. And you, Garrett Steele, what do you want? The first heavy raindrops began to fall, pattering against the roof of the porch. For 20 years, I've wanted absolution, he admitted. Freedom from the ghosts of Sand Creek. Now I understand that's not possible. Some debts can never be fully repaid. The rain intensified, turning the yard to mud, washing the dust from the air. But perhaps, he continued, there's something better than absolution. Perhaps there's transformation, building something new from the broken pieces of the past, not to forget, but to create a future worth living for. Kiona stepped closer, her presence a counterpoint to the storm's wild energy. And am I part of that future you imagine? Instead of answering with words, Garrett reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. Together, they stepped off the porch into the downpour. The rain fell like silver curtains around them, soaking their clothing, plastering Kiona's dark hair against her shoulders. Garrett tilted his face to the sky, feeling the water wash away dust and weariness and doubt. This rain belongs to the land, Kiona said, echoing words from their first meeting. It cleanses what was broken. It keeps those who deserve to remain. Garrett turned to her, water streaming down his face like tears he had never allowed himself to shed for Sand Creek's victims. Then let it keep us both. In that moment, beneath the healing rain, they came together not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals who had found in each other something neither had expected. A chance to build a bridge between worlds that had been separate for too long. Their lips met, warm against the cool rain, a promise more binding than words or ceremonies. Around them, the parched Montana earth drank in the life-giving water, already preparing for new growth where only dust had existed before. The storm continued through the afternoon and into evening, gentle now rather than fierce. They worked side by side to repair the damage Hammond's men had caused to the ranch, mending fences, replacing broken windows, restoring order where chaos had reigned. As night fell, they sat on the porch, watching the rain turn gentle, listening to its rhythm on the roof. Kiona's head rested against Garrett's shoulder, her breathing steady and peaceful. The red cloth around his wrist had darkened when wet, the color of deep commitment rather than violence. There will be others like Hammond, Kiona said, practical even in this moment of peace. Men who want what isn't theirs to take. Yes, Garrett agreed, but next time they'll find something they don't expect. What's that? A rancher who stands with the Apache, a woman who bridges two worlds, a place where the best of both can survive. In the darkness, lightning flashed across the distant mountains, illuminating the land that had witnessed so much bloodshed, yet still held promise for those willing to nurture it. The thunder that followed seemed less threatening now, more like the earth itself acknowledging a covenant between its children. Garrett looked out at his ranch, no longer a lonely outpost of a solitary man, but the beginning of something new. Perhaps he thought this was the true meaning of redemption, not escaping the past, but transforming it into a foundation for something better. Beside him, Kiona watched the same rain with eyes that had seen both the worst and the best of what people could do to one another. Yet she had chosen to stay, to build rather than destroy, to create rather than avenge. Together they sat in companionable silence as the storm gradually passed, leaving behind a cleansed world glittering with promise under the emerging stars. Where the red earth had drunk in the rain, seeds long dormant would soon begin to grow. 3 days after the council, as dusk settled over the ranch, Scout's warning bark split the air. Garrett reached for his Winchester, already moving toward the door. Kiona was at the window, her body tense. "Riders," she said quietly. 6, maybe 7. Not Apache. Through his spyglass, Garrett made out the familiar figure of Hammond's hired gun in the lead. Somehow the colonel had evaded justice in Denver and sent his men for revenge. "Get to the cellar," Garrett ordered, but Kiona was already checking her revolver. "This is my home too," she said simply. Before Garrett could argue, dust clouds rose to the east. Apache riders, at least a dozen, led by Running Wolf. They approached from the opposite direction of Hammond's men, converging on the ranch from both sides. For a terrible moment, Garrett feared a three-way battle. Then Running Wolf raised his hand in a signal, and his warriors spread out in a defensive formation around the ranch house. The message was clear. An attack on the rancher who wore the red cloth was an attack on the tribe. Hammond's men reined in hard, caught between Apache warriors and Garrett's rifle. After a tense standoff, they turned their horses and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Running Wolf nodded once to Garrett before leading his men back toward Apache territory. No words were needed. The alliance was real, tested, and proven. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Garrett took Kiona's hand. "Your uncle didn't have to come." "No," she agreed, "but he chose to, just as you chose to help me when you found me in the desert." She looked at him. "This is how change begins, one choice at a time." A week later came the first rain of the season, washing away the last traces of dust and doubt. 1 year later, the steel ranch stood transformed. A trading post had risen near the main house, where Apache craftsmen bartered blankets and silverwork for supplies. Several Apache families had built traditional wickiups on the eastern edge of the property, while 2 former cavalrymen, friends of Jenkins, had settled in cabins to the west. Garrett stood on the porch, watching a group of Apache children learn to rope from a grizzled rancher. Nearby, Kiona was teaching a settler's wife the medicinal properties of desert plants. Their son, just 3 months old, slept peacefully in a cradleboard beside her. His copper skin a shade lighter than his mother's, his eyes the steel gray of his father's. On the fence post at the property's edge hung 2 items side by side: Garrett's old cavalry hat and an Apache medicine pouch. The message was clear to all who passed. This was a boundary crossed, a middle ground where 2 worlds met. "Your father arrives tomorrow," Garrett said as Kiona joined him on the porch. "Running Wolf sent word." "The first council meeting at neutral ground," she replied, taking his hand. "They're bringing 7 chiefs. And the territorial governor," Garrett added. Jenkins convinced him. They gazed out at what they'd built, not just structures, but understanding, not peace through forgetting, but healing through remembering differently. The red cloth tied around both their wrists had faded with time and work, but the bond it symbolized had only strengthened. This was their legacy, a crossing place, a beginning. And though both knew the larger world would continue its relentless push westward, here they had created something that might endure, a small, imperfect model of what could be.